It actually says topics of the day. I didn't consciously do that. So the methodology of the poll, because everybody wants to be a polling methodologist these days. Then we'll look at the general election matchups. Certainty of voting, because voter turnout, of course, is a topic of much interest and its impact. The images of the candidates are particularly appropriate, and you'll see them in the next two surveys that we're doing in October and the 1st of November. Because candidate image is one of those things that can be pretty dynamic over the course of the campaign. It's where advertising can have its effects. So going to pay a lot of attention to that throughout the year. Or the fall now. Issue concerns, you saw some of this in the last couple of polls, but still, what's the public concerned about? How's that changing, if at all? And then particular issues, because we also ask about a variety of specific issues rather than just general concern about issues. And so that's the agenda for today with subtopics of each of those. So the methodology is pretty much the same as what we always do. We were in the field September 6th through the 11th, so from the day after Labor Day until last Sunday. We interviewed 801 registered voters, 72% by cell, 28% by landline. For the full sample, the margin of error is 4.3 percentage points. For the sample of likely voters, 632 respondents. Those are people who say they're absolutely certain to vote in the coming election. That's the likely voter definition we've used always. And that has a margin of error of plus or minus 4.9 points. I'll say it now and probably repeat it in a minute. Now that we're in the fall election campaign, I'll be emphasizing likely voter results instead of registered voter results that we've done previously. Last month, I showed you the likely voter results as well as the registered voter results, and they're in the press release from last time. But today, I'm going to compare likely voters now with likely voters a month ago, and those likely voters are slightly different, only a little bit, but are slightly different in August from the registered voter numbers. So those of you who are responsible for writing down those numbers, be aware that the apples to apples comparison now is likely voters this time with likely voters last time. And those comparisons are in the press release as well as in the slides. So I don't think there'll be any confusion, but just so you know. We also report the registered voter results so you can also see what they were, but for talking purposes, mostly likely voters. Partisan makeup of the sample is 30% Republican, 29 Democrat, and 41 Independent. With leaners, it's 45, 44, and 10. The long-term balance is 30% Republican, 28 Democrat, so 1 percentage point higher on Democrats this time, 41% Independent. And with leaners included, 45, 44 is the same on the partisan side. We're 1 point high on independents this time, so not much difference. So let's get to it. Some things have changed this time. And so we'll start with the biggest change, and that is that we have Ron Johnson with a 1 point advantage over Mandela Barnes this time, after Barnes had a significant lead last time. We'll talk through the elements of that change, and you'll see them as we go through, but certainly a race that in the immediate post-primary moment had moved Barnes into a lead. He had been up by a couple of points in June and then bumped up to 7. But remember last time I pointed out that both primary winners, Michaels on the governor's side and Barnes on the Senate side, seemed to have gotten a 5-point boost from winning the primary. And we were in the field right after the primary. So it's not surprising if this would shift. But the other thing is pretty obvious that Lieutenant Governor Barnes faced very little criticism during the Democratic primary. There weren't attack ads out from his primary opponents. And then at the end, the party coalesced behind him, even a couple of weeks before the end of the primary. So I think you'd expect him to be in a very good position at that point, and that's exactly what we found. This time, you can see it's tightened considerably. A 1-point difference, that's obviously inside the margin of error. The right characterization here is a toss-up. But Johnson is at 49 and Barnes at 48, again, with likely voters here. Let's look at just the trend, and you can see Barnes and Johnson. The likely voters for Barnes was a 7-point lead, as well as a 7-point lead with registered voters last time, so it was the same lead. And now those two lines have just barely crossed, so we'll see where that plays out in a minute as we get into the components of support for both Senator Johnson and Lieutenant Governor Barnes. We'll see some things there. On the governor's side, Tony Evers has a 3-point advantage over Tim Michels. This is, again, inside the margin of error. Last time with registered voters, that was a 2-point lead, but with likely voters in August, it was a 4-point lead. So it's actually a very slight tightening from a 4-point with likelies to a 3-point with likelies. You can see Beglinger at 5%, the independent candidate on the ballot. She has since suspended her campaign, but you can't get off the ballot at this point. So her name will appear on the November ballot as an independent candidate and an alternative to the two major party candidates. And there's a very small don't know of 3%. I will remind you, this is in the press release, but I'll remind you that these are leaned votes. So if somebody initially says they're undecided, we push them and say, if you had to choose today, who would you choose from? And so we have a fairly small don't know percentage. If you go to the website, you can see the top lines for the unleaned vote as well as the leaned vote. But I think our experience has been that the leaned vote is a more useful measure. And so that's what we're doing. Okay. Here's the dynamics of that race, but you can hardly see any dynamics. It's just that slight tightening inside the margin of error last time, more inside the margin of error this time. Beglinger actually ticked up 1 point when we, this month rather than last month. Okay, how about sticking with the governor's race for a second? What's going on in the sources of the vote for each of these candidates? And you see the two really tall bars here on the left, 95% of Democrats for Evers, 92% of Republicans for Michels. That's hardly changed from a month ago when it was 94, 92. So trivial difference there. Parties are really united. I don't think that surprises anybody in these days of polarized politics, but it is strikingly high levels of party loyalty. If you look at crossover votes, that would be 3% of Republicans going for Evers. It was 5% last month. So a little coming home there, a little less willing to cross over. Look at the other side, 4% of Democrats are voting for Tim Michels. That's actually up from the 2% that were crossing over last time. When I say up, remember these are really small numbers and really small changes in support, but you got to point them out. The independent vote is more interesting and is going to be important all through our conversation for the rest of the year. 45% of independents for Evers, 39 for Michels. That was 49-38 last month. The net of all of this is there hasn't been a lot of change in the alignments in the governor's race. Where they have changed, they've just changed by small percentage points in fairly small groups of folks. Independents just a little bit tighter this time than they were last time, but still leaning towards Evers. So the result of all of that is that tiny 1-point tightening of the race. But let's look at the Senate race, and here you'll see what has converted a 7-point Barnes advantage into a 1-point Johnson advantage. And let's just cut to the chase. It's the independents. Last month, independents were hugely for Barnes, 55-40. Again, coming right off of the primary victory. But this time, they're leaning to Johnson by 2 points, 48-46. Partisan attachment is pretty similar, but Johnson's up to 97% of Republicans from 94 a month ago. And Barnes is at 96, actually down 3 points from the 99. A nearly unanimous support last time. So strongly aligned partisan groups, but slight shifts in the margin of partisans and shifts that in balance favor Johnson, more Republican loyalty, slightly less Democratic loyalty. But the big shift is those independents. And that was a really big shift. Crossover vote also down. Barnes getting only 2% of Republicans this time versus 6% last time. And crossover to Johnson at 4% of Democrats this time versus 0% last time. So again, some shifts within party, though they're pretty small, but big shifts with independents, quite a big shift. Last month, one of the points we made, the data made, was that Mandela Barnes had very positive views of him, favorable versus unfavorable. And I told you then, but 41% said they didn't know enough to have an opinion about him. And I said, so his strength coming out of the primary is people have a very positive impression of him. But the downside is that 41% that aren't familiar with him are ripe for the campaigns to have an effect. And his campaign could win them over, but conversely, the Johnson campaign could make people have a more negative view of him. And I think we see that this time. And that's especially true of independents. And you see the results right here for how that's worked out. Certainty of voting, on the other hand, is something that favors Democrats this time. After most of the year, Republicans having at least a little advantage, this time 80% of Democrats say they're absolutely certain they're going to vote, versus 77% of Republicans and 71% of independents. Both Democrats and Republicans are a little down from last month. This is last month, this is this month. So it's 80 Dem, 77 Rep. It was 83 Rep, 82 Dem. So they've both shifted down just a shade and a little bit to the Democrats' advantage. I wouldn't make too much of this. We're still a couple of months, help me. Are we really just a month and a half away from the election? Shoot. There's still time for people to decide whether they're really going to vote, and I wouldn't make too much of that. But the balance point, I think, is the important one. During June, we saw Democrats less enthusiastic about voting, Republicans more enthusiastic. When we shifted to likelihood of voting, we saw them basically dead even last month. And now we see this slight Democratic advantage. Those can shift more before we get to Election Day, but that's where it stands now. The upshot is this 3-point Democratic turnout advantage helps the Democratic candidates just a little bit, but not extraordinarily much compared to, if there were a 10-point gap in turnout, which we're not close to. Okay. Let's look at the impact of that turnout or the certainty of voting on the vote for governor. And the answer is it doesn't make much difference. If we look at the green bars, that's all registered voters. then Evers has a 1-point margin. It's also 1 point if you look at those who are certain or very likely to vote. And finally, if you look at likely voters, those who are absolutely certain to vote, it's a 3-point advantage. So a little bit of an aid to Evers if we go from all registered voters, which would correspond to an extraordinarily high turnout election, to just likely voters, which would be more normal for a midterm. But you can see the sensitivity to turnout is only modest here. On the Senate race, it's pretty much the same story. Johnson has a 1-point advantage with all registered voters, a 2-point advantage with certain or likely vote, people who say they're likely to vote. Sorry, it's a bad use of that term. And finally, back to a 1-point advantage with what we define as likely voters, those people who say they're absolutely certain they're going to vote. So not much sensitivity to turnout at this point. That makes sense. As long as the two parties are so closely balanced in their certainty of voting, it's unlikely that we would see much of a shift as we do this, but we'll keep this sensitivity analysis every time so you can see how the definition of the electorate might be affecting the results. Okay, I've already previewed candidate images, but let's look at these. So here's the gubernatorial candidates. Evers' favorability is now 45-45. That's a bit of a tightening from before, with about 10% that don't give an opinion of him. Michaels is 34 favorable, 39 unfavorable. That's a little bit of an uptick. It was about even in the August survey. And the percent don't know is at 27. That's down a bit from a month ago. So more people are getting to know him. But his unfavorables went up a little bit compared to where he was last month. Finally, Beglinger, 3% have a favorable view, 6% an unfavorable view, and 91% say they don't know enough about her to have an opinion. This is not uncommon for independent candidates who are not running an active campaign, not running advertising, not doing the things that many campaigns do. But again, there will be that name on the ballot, and it will say independent. And so people who are disaffected with either of the two or both of the two major parties may very well be pulled over to her. We normally see that support in polls for third party and independent candidates runs in the mid-single digits in August and September. For example, in 2018, we had a libertarian candidate for Senate who was getting 7 or 8% of the vote. By the end of this fall, that had come down to 3% in our final survey, and he actually got 3%. So we'll see what happens here, but you know, it's on the ballot, so have to pay attention to that. On the favorability on the Senate side, though, Barnes's advantage in favorability last time has largely disappeared, now just a net 1 point favorable. His don't knows have come down considerably. That was 41% last time. It's now, help me, 34%. Still room for people to get to know him. And the same thing for Michaels, I think. But again, what does this say about the impressions that have been formed over the last month? On balance, they have pulled Barnes from a net quite favorable position to basically an even break. Johnson, on the other hand, hasn't changed very much. 39 favorable, 47 unfavorable, a net -8. He's been running -8, -9. There's not much change here. I think perhaps most importantly is the favorable numbers haven't moved up, which they did during the 2016 campaign, and we're not seeing that change now. But from a campaign's perspective, you also run against the other guy. So the weakening positivity to Barnes is an important part of the campaign story that's going on right now. Okay, now here's a new question. Which candidate for governor better understands the problems of ordinary people in Wisconsin? 47% say Evers does, 41% say Johnson does. That's a 6-point gap to compare to the 3-point vote margin. So Evers has a little bit of an image advantage on this question. And 11% say they don't know. The same question for the Senate, Barnes at 44, Johnson at 40, a little bit tighter on that. And 1% say they both. We're very understanding candidates, but 15% say neither or don't know. So this could shift too. I mean, all of these can shift, right? But on this image of how well do you relate to ordinary people in Wisconsin is, I think, a pretty appropriate question for candidates trying to appeal to voters. So the Democrats' races have tightened, or in the Senate race, Johnson has taken a little bit of an edge. You see the tightening on the favorability numbers and a little better understanding of the candidates. But on these two questions of understanding, small Democratic advantages still. How about shares my values? Evers is now a point underwater on that. 47 shares, 48 does not. Michael's 41 shares, 47 does not. So both of these candidates have moved to a very slightly negative position on shares my values. Notice the 11% don't know about Michael's versus the 5% with Evers. These incumbents are better known than the challengers. Challengers are getting better known, but there's still a gap there that the campaigns can influence. On the Senate side, Barnes is +3 on shares values. Johnson is -9 on shared values. Again, a comparative advantage to Barnes, not a big net positive, but he's slightly net positive. But again, 15% say they can't say whether he shares their values versus 7% for Johnson. So that same less familiarity with challengers. How about this question? How effective has Tony Evers been as governor of Wisconsin? 18% very effective, 35% somewhat. Put those two together, 53% say very or somewhat effective, 20% not very, and 23% not at all effective, 43% with a negative view of him, and 3% who are not sure or don't know. Same question for Senator Johnson. How effective has Senator Ron Johnson been as a U.S. Senator? 50% say he's been effective, 20% very, plus 30% not somewhat. 12% not very effective, and 30% not at all, 42% there. 7% say they don't know. So here between these two, there doesn't look like there's a whole lot of difference in perceived effectiveness. They both have a bare majority or a slight majority who say effective, and they have something in the low 40s that say not effective, and then some who don't know. But there's not much difference there. Fair bet that different people see them as effective. There's no doubt a big partisan effect there. But the net balance is both of them are seen as a little more effective than ineffective. How about response to the coronavirus? Do you approve or disapprove of the way Tony Evers responded to the coronavirus? 50%, 27% strongly approve, 23% somewhat approve, But on the disapprove side, 13 somewhat disapprove and 29 strongly disapprove. You should be noticing that something like 50 to 42 keeps coming up here, that sort of split keeps coming. 8% didn't have an opinion about how he responded. We asked the same question with the same wording about Senator Johnson. Do you approve or disapprove of the way Senator Johnson responded to the coronavirus epidemic? 34% approve, 17 strongly and 17 somewhat. 9% somewhat disapprove, and 37 strongly disapprove, 46% altogether disapproving. It's interesting that 18% say they don't have an opinion about him. I think it's fair to say that Senator Johnson spoke a good deal about the coronavirus epidemic, but 18% of our registered voters here in the state didn't form an opinion about his response. I think partly you're seeing a difference between legislators off in Washington versus governors here in the state, and there is a difference in the salience of them in the news and people paying attention. There's also a difference in policy. Tony Evers had some direct responsibility for the coronavirus response, while a single senator has rhetorical abilities but doesn't directly control policy. So maybe there's something to that as well. What about Evers' response to the protests and violence in Kenosha in August of 2020? 16% strongly approve, 22 somewhat approve, that's 38% approve, and 10% somewhat and 37 strongly disapprove, so 47% disapprove of how he handled Kenosha. But here too, 15% say they don't know, which I find a little surprising, but you know, again, maybe that'll change during the course of the campaign. But it does show why you're seeing some ads that bring up Kenosha. This is a weakness for Evers in our data, at least. Okay, let's look at Tony Evers' job approval. 44% approve, 47 disapprove. That's the beige bars here. That's only the second time since he took office that we've had him net negative on job approval. We had him 1 point net negative in October last year, but that was the only time until now with a net -3 job approval. You look at the partisan differences, and I think they're, again, pretty predictable. 9% approval with Republicans, 42 with independents, 85 with Democrats. It's sort of the mirror image among Republicans. I do want to point out, though, those pesky independents who are so interesting. 42 approve, 48 disapprove. That's an important group for the election, and seeing them turn net negative towards Evers' job performance is a warning signal to the Evers campaign that this is an important group that, you know, a 6-point gap is not gigantic, but it's not nothing either. The trend in Evers' job approval is interesting. The green line is approve, and you can see that's generally been higher than the purple disapprove line. The black line is don't know, and you see early in his term, people didn't know yet what they thought, but that pretty rapidly went down to flat and has stayed flat. But what I do want to point out are these last set of dots. Starting here is the first poll of 2022. At that point in February, he was +9 net approval. The next poll, it was +6, then +3, then +2 last month, and now -3 this month. So that's a pretty steady trend over the course of this year. You might normally expect that in a campaign year, gubernatorial approvals tend to tighten as you get into the campaign process. But I think this is not a case of a single poll standing as an outlier. Instead, this has been a quite steady progression over the course of the year. Is worrisome news for the Evers campaign and happy news for the Michaels campaign. And you saw a minute ago where there'd been a little bit of a shift among independents who had become a little negative towards Evers. So we'll see how that works out as the rest of the campaign progresses. But after generally being in pretty positive territory on this, the last 9 months have seen some real tightening and now a negative net approval rating this time. Okay, issue concerns. All year, we've been asking people what they're worried about, how concerned are they with a variety of issues. We've been using the very concerned percentage as the benchmark for this. Doesn't seem worth it to complicate it, but you can be very concerned, somewhat concerned, and so on. So here's the lineup of issues from over here on the left. Coronavirus, nah, past that, don't care. 2, inflation over on the far right. Reading right to left now, inflation remains the top concern as it has for most of the year, followed by crime, followed by accurate vote count. This is the first time we've asked that. National polling has shown concern about voting and the integrity of voting, and it really matters how you word that because the two different parties see this as an important issue, but they see it in very different contexts. So the way I asked the question was, how concerned are you about ensuring the accuracy of the vote count? Okay. May not be the best, but it's what I used. I'm pretty happy with it. But you see that comes in third place, then concern about public schools is fourth place, gun violence fifth, abortion policy sixth, and then taxes, climate change, and illegal immigration less concern to people as we move to the right. We'll come back to this in just a second. Here's that inflation concern over the course of the last year. Concern was not trivial, but it was only 50% in August a year ago, but it's climbed steadily over the year. But last month, it was striking that it ticked down for the first time by about 7 points. This month, it's back up by about 3 points, so it didn't recoup all of the losses of this month, but it did tick slightly back up. And of course, we got a new inflation report yesterday, which is further grist. I'm happy to say I only paid $2.29 for gas yesterday, $3.29 for gas yesterday, not $2.29. That would be a fantasy. Here's the point of, we saw this last month as well. The partisans care about very different sets of issues. And so inflation is the highest concern way up here. For Republicans, drops off some with independents, drops off more with Democrats. So of the top issues for Republicans, inflation, illegal immigration, and taxes are near the top of the list. Accurate vote count is a little lower, but also fairly high. Crime is kind of flat. There's not no difference between the parties, but there's not a huge difference between the parties. And public schools are about equally concerning to all partisans and independents. Come down to the bottom and you see climate change, which is near the top for Democrats. Gun violence is higher as a percentage, though there's not quite as big of a Republican-Democratic gap for gun violence. And finally, abortion policy, which remember was only number 6 overall, ends up being the third highest concern among Democrats. So we're basically seeing the parties concerned about mostly different things with a few things that there's some overlap on. So particular issues. So these are the individual issues that we ask about as opposed to your generalized concern about topics. And there's not been a lot of change in views of overturning Roe versus Wade. 30% favor that decision, 63% opposed, but a solid majority of Republicans favor the decision, 59 to 29. Independents, though, are strongly opposed, 28 to 66. And finally, Democrats are virtually unanimous in opposing that decision. There have only been the smallest of movements in this over the last month, and nothing that changes the basic qualitative picture. What about allowing abortion to be legal in cases of rape and incest? 83% say it should be, those exceptions should be legal. Only 10% say that we should not allow that exception. That is a little bit down. It was 88% last month that said this exception should be legal. So it's come down slightly from 88 to 83. A little bit of shuffling within the parties. Republicans were at 79% last month saying it should be legal for rape and incest. That's down a little bit to 70% this time, which is part of why there's been some motion on this. The size of the majority is still quite substantial, though. How about student loan forgiveness? This is new because the Biden administration just announced this. 30% strongly favor student loan forgiveness, 17% somewhat favor it. 8% somewhat opposed, 42% strongly opposed, so 47 to 50%. Pretty close divide on this issue. I'm going to put a footnote in. If you look at the press release, when we put together strongly and somewhat, it rounds to 46 instead of 47. Here you're seeing 30 and 17 because both of those numbers are rounded. In the press release, we added the numbers and then rounded. And I tell you, I did not hate rounding nearly so much until I took this job. But just so you know, that's why there's a little bit of a difference there, but that's the way rounding works sometimes. Still, the substantive point would be exactly the same. We have a close division of opinion on student loan forgiveness, with Republicans quite opposed, 74% strongly opposed. Among independents, 46% favor and 49% opposed. So among independents, it's pretty much a wash on that as well. And Democrats are pretty positive to it. 84% of Democrats approve of student loan forgiveness. There's been a lot of talk about this and who benefits and who favors it. So let's look at that. Here we're looking at two things at once. We're looking at age across the bottom, and the purple bars are non-college graduates and the green bars are college graduates. And the big effect here is age, not college graduation. Young people, regardless of whether they go to college or not, or graduated from college or not, are 3/4 in favor of loan forgiveness. And it's just 2 points higher with college grads than non-college grads among that youngest age group. Support drops off with 30 to 44-year-olds with, again, just a 2-point college advantage. Drops more in the 45 to 59, drops more in the 60 plus, with the exception that the 60 plus college grads are rather positive towards it. They kind of tip back up on this. That's the one case where graduation seems maybe to be having an effect. But I think the takeaway here is this is a policy that is warmly embraced by people in their 20s, less so in their 30s to mid 40s, and drops off with age. But the idea that non-college grads would be much more opposed and college grads much more in favor, I think is not borne out in our data. The education effect here is really quite small compared to the age effect, which is pretty substantial. To the extent that as a policy, it might mobilize younger people to vote, maybe, but it's certainly not galvanizing folks on either direction for the older age groups, and it's underwater with the older age groups. Okay, crime. You hear a lot about crime these days. So this is a question about personal safety. Do you generally feel safe, or do you generally worry about crime while going about your daily activities? This is a measure designed to capture what your lived experience of fear of crime or sense of safety represents. And across the state, 76% say they feel safe, but nearly a quarter, 23%, say they worry about their safety. But this is a case where there's just no partisan difference here. It's quite lovely, in fact. 78% of Republicans, 75% of independents, 76% of Democrats feel safe going about their daily lives. I don't want to diminish the quarter that feel concerned, and we'll turn to them in just a second. But I do think, given how partisan so much of politics and policy is, it's important to keep in mind that personal experience of crime really doesn't have a partisan component to it. And that gap has more to do with where you live than it does who you are politically. But what about your answer about how concerned you are about crime? That's the question we actually showed you earlier when we were talking about issue concerns. Coming back to it, 61% say they're very concerned about crime, even though only 23% said they personally worried about their safety. But that does show a pretty strong partisan gradient, with 71% of Republicans very concerned, 61% of independents, and dropping to 47% among Democrats. So I think here you're seeing crime is an abstract issue, not necessarily where you live, does have big partisan differences. But crime, as in, do I feel safe going down the street for a cup of coffee? No partisan differences really at all. So let's look a little bit more about where you live and what the effect is. I'm pooling 3 recent surveys of this, so I have a lot of cases within each region so I can show you what's going on within regions. Hadn't changed much over time. Overall, that 79-20 split we already saw, but look at people in the city of Milwaukee. 52% feel safe, but 48% worry. That's maybe not a surprising result, but it's pretty vivid about the experience of living in the city. But the purple bar, these are the rest of the Milwaukee media market. This is not just the WOW counties, it's the wider surrounding counties that are part of the media market here. But 74% in those suburbs feel safe, 24% feel worried, half the level of worry among residents of the city. Then it drops off a little bit more on the worry side as you move to the Madison, Green Bay, and north and west of the state areas. And feeling safe rises from the 74 here in the suburbs to 82, 87, and 85. So most of the state, 3 of the 5 regions, feel quite safe in their daily activities. I think the 74% among the suburbs is pretty high too. But in the city, there's much more concern about personal safety. What about concern about crime by region? The city, the green bar, is high, 74%. But this is so interesting. The purple bar is now nearly as high. So the suburbs are much more concerned about crime, even though in terms of their personal safety, they look more like the rest of the state rather than more like the city. And so there's an interesting shift there. And then when you move to the rest of the state, there's about 50% more or less being very concerned about crime, considerably less in the rest of the state. So when we talk about the crime issue, it's something that has a partisan component, it has a geographic component, presumably it has a real world component. And so I think all of these things are important for an informed, thoughtful discussion of crime and how we deal with it and who feels threatened and for whom it's a personal threat versus for whom it's a more symbolic issue or an issue of worry about other places, not necessarily your personal circumstances. COVID, let's talk about COVID, even if nobody cares about it anymore. We've been asking this question since the first days of COVID. Do you think the closure of schools and businesses was an appropriate reaction to the coronavirus outbreak? Or do you think it was an overreaction that did more harm than good? We first asked that in March of 2020, just as we were all going into the shutdowns, and we've asked it multiple times since to see how opinion has changed on this. So in this latest survey, 56% say it was an appropriate response. 41% say it was an overreaction. And big partisan gaps, probably not surprising. But here, look at those independents again. Now, for independents, 55% say it was appropriate, 41% say it was an overreaction. But Republicans, it's 19 appropriate, 78 overreaction. Democrats, 89 appropriate, 10 overreaction. So again, those differences are not surprising, but where independents fall on this is interesting. And opinion on this question has evolved over time. Here's how it's evolved over time. When we were in the midst of the shutdown, over 80% said it was the appropriate thing to do at the time. That dropped off a month or two later, but still maintained high majorities saying it was appropriate. And then since then, each time we've asked, saying it was appropriate has come down a little bit, saying it was an overreaction has risen a fair bit. But where we stand today is that still on balance, more people see it as an appropriate response rather than an overreaction. This is one of our continuing questions of how people see public schools and property taxes. In this survey, 41% say they're more concerned with reducing property taxes, 51% more concerned with increasing funding for K-12 education. But, and there's a partisan split that's not surprising, but on this one, independents are leaning towards property taxes rather than school funding. And that's a bit of a shift over recent history to see independents now a bit more concerned about property taxes. So stay tuned to this. The overall 41-51 is just the smallest increase in net support for school funding and slight decrease in property taxes. But we've seen this running in the low 40s, more concerned about property taxes, high 40s to low 50s, more concerned about K-12 funding. There's not been a whole lot of shift, but that independent group is kind of interesting. Let me just point out to you that we've looked at independents a lot today. And on some of them, they're leaning more to Republicans or Republican issues. In some, they're leaning more to Democratic issues or Democrats. Those pesky independents, they're really interesting. They're not just fixed and only doing a partisan thing. How about satisfaction with the public schools in your community? Something that's not completely unrelated to the previous question. 19% are very satisfied, 43% somewhat, so we're up to 62% satisfied. 20% dissatisfied and 11% very dissatisfied, 31 dissatisfied. There hadn't been a lot of movement in this. We've typically found this question to show that around 60 to 65% say they're very or somewhat satisfied. And we ask it specifically, the public schools in your community, rather than some generalized public schools without any reference. Again, as with that fear of crime question, I'm trying to get a little bit at what people's personal experiences are vis-a-vis the public schools. So hence asked about your community. There hadn't been a lot of trend in this. There are some partisan differences, but 51% of Republicans are satisfied or very satisfied. It's higher with independents and it's higher with Democrats. So there is some partisan divide here, but it's not the case that a majority of Republicans even are very dissatisfied with their public schools. No doubt we will continue to debate the fate of public schools until Alan retires, quits writing about education. Yeah, you know, he's not allowed to. That's never going to happen. How about right direction, wrong track? We're still on the wrong track, but less so than we were last time. Sorry, checking the time. Big party differences, no surprise, but look at the trend on it. Back in, I started this in 2019 with the beginning of the Evers administration. That was net positive until we get into 2020. COVID hits, things kind of fall apart, and there's a gap in our polling too on this question, not in polls altogether, but we didn't repeat the question for a while. And when we came back to this in 2021, off on the wrong track was much higher, right direction much lower. That's true of national polling too. We're not really very different there. This time I gave you the whole chart, and you can see here at the end, for the first time in a long time, there was a slight uptick in right direction, a slight decline in wrong track, but the balance is still solidly wrong track. There's some people believe that this is the great predictor of elections. I'm not one of them, but it's important to know how we feel about what's going on in our state. Biden job approval is unchanged from last time. 40 approved, 55 disapproved, giant party differences. Independents heavily disapproving of the president. 30 disapprove, 35 approve. I'm a little surprised on this because nationally his approval numbers have ticked up 4 or 5 points recently, but we're not seeing it yet in our data. Here's the trend in that, and you can again just see that the green line has been flat. There was a little downtick in August in disapproval, but then it didn't change this time. So no real trend there. Tammy Baldwin's favorability is slightly negative this time, 37 favorable, 40% unfavorable. She usually runs 2 to 4 points net favorable. I think if you look over all of our questions, you might see a hint of growing negativity towards the candidates. And that may carry over to her, even though she's not a candidate right now. I'm not yet ready to say we look at a race to the bottom, but I don't think it's a stretch to think that by November, people may have negative views of all 4 candidates. As you know, campaigns have their effect, negative ads have their effect. But it is notable that as a current non-combatant in the campaign, she's ticked a little negative this time. Confidence in the accuracy of the 2020 election remains an issue before us, but there's not been much change at all. 65% are confident in the election outcome, 34% not confident. That's close to the reverse among Republicans, where nearly 2/3 are not confident. 63% this time, to be exact. About 35% of Republicans confident. So there is a little bit of a divide in the party, even though it's really clear where the majority opinion is about the 2020 election. And independents, 64% are confident in the 2020 election. Trump favorability also has barely budged. We just keep watching this and it keeps going along without much change. 38% favorable, 58% unfavorable, but 79% of Republicans, so this accounts illustrates Trump's strong power within the Republican Party and why he's such a dominant force in the party. But when you move to independents, the 32-63 split, and unsurprisingly, Democrats unanimously negative about him. And so that's our story today. I think we actually have a few minutes for Q&A, if I don't fall down.
Confusion level is enormous. I said the confusion level is enormous.
Confusion is enormous is the point. I think there is an element as you look through this of mixed opinions and movement that's moving in different directions. Again, I think an utterly predictable tightening of the races as the fall campaign has really kicked in and people are forming views of both Tim Michels and Mandela Barnes coming down from relatively high levels of don't know and coming down from the August data of post-primary bounces that both of those candidates benefited from. Seeing net negatives and barely net positives for the candidates is sort of the basis of my speculation that we might see everybody be seen net negatively by election day, but maybe I'll be wrong. Maybe we'll all embrace and sing happy songs and that won't happen. If it happens, I'm going to claim credit for it, but for predicting it, I mean. No, but seriously, yeah, this is normal politics to see this sort of tightening. Yes?
Any thoughts as to why Democrats may be less concerned with inflation?
Oh, I think it's, I've joked that it's because they're Democratic grocery stores that charge a lot less than Republican grocery stores, which makes the absurd point. We are all in this boat together, and yet we have such different perspectives. I think there's two sides going on. Inflation is a great issue for the out party to attack the in party on. So Republicans gravitate to inflation because it's the perfect cudgel for beating up on Biden. Democrats have exactly the opposite incentive. They know their president is vulnerable on this, and so they tend to discount the importance of it. So I think it's heavily driven by partisans wanting to cheer for their side. That happens with every issue. I don't want to say inflation is unique, but it is unique that inflation is that one thing that incumbents never benefit from as an issue. And so you have a sharp divide. But it does show the gap between our lived experience, again, what we're paying at the pump and at the grocery store, versus our more symbolic experience of saying this is a big problem or not so big a problem. Yes?
Methodology of the poll. Why did you choose the cell phone and landline combination instead of incorporating, text messaging, online?
Sure.
Did you notice a specific age difference or age skew?
Yeah. There are a couple of stories to that. 70%, 72% cell phone is because that's what federal statistics say is the exclusive use of cell phones, people who only have a cell phone. So that's where that split comes from. In fact, today, 92 or 93% of the public has a cell phone, but it's still not 99%, and so we continue to include some landlines for that reason. Text messaging is an interesting development. I would say research and development project. We actually ran a survey in July of 2020 to test the feasibility of text to web and did not find it performed very well with the parallel telephone survey we did at the time. I don't have any religious objections to it, but I just don't think the technology is proven. There are plenty of good, high-quality professional pollsters that are now including maybe a third or a quarter of their samples as text to web, but that's the reason we haven't gone there yet. But an open mind as soon as I can find powerful evidence that it really does work as well as phone. I will take one question and then I've got to go. In the back, you had your hand up earlier.
election?
No, we have not at all. Yeah. Limited space on the survey is the basic answer. All right, that was quick, so I'll try you as well.
Election, the Democrats made a fair amount of progress.
Yeah.
One-time thing, or is that?
Yeah. So the suburbs, particularly the WOW counties, Democrats have been doing better. They're still losing the WOW counties, but they're losing them by less. In 2020, the net Republican vote was 40,000 fewer net votes in the WOW counties than it had been in 2012. Statewide margin was 23,000. So you can see as a practical matter, that's mattered. Now, the question is, with this year's election, with a senator and a governor at stake, will those suburbs come home? And I think in emphasizing concern about crime, you can see a certain appeal to the Milwaukee suburbs on that issue, right? And so whether it happens or not, I can't tell you today, but it's certainly something that post-election we'll really want to look into and see whether this trend of the suburbs becoming less solidly Republican has continued. I will say it's not a Trump-only phenomenon. We saw Scott Walker's vote go way down. We saw a vote for conservative Supreme Court candidates go down, as well as vote for Trump go down in those areas. So I do think it's more than just a Trump phenomena, but that's where we are. All right, thank you all so much. We'll be back in a month.
Recording stopped.
Thank you, Mr. Franklin.
Thank you.
Very important.